He is one of the most notorious serial killers in America. His crimes in Wisconsin shocked the nation because not only did he murder, he also robbed graves and did despicable things with body parts. A lot of famous horror movies were based on him. Psychiatrists said he had a mental illness that is unparalleled in modern history. How did Ed Gein become a real-life psycho? Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name's Anne, but I also go by my nickname Nini. I like to focus on Midwest true crime because I'm a Minnesota farmer's daughter. Today we're going to go to Wisconsin to talk about one of the most infamous murderers in America, Ed Gein. His crimes are shocking. They occurred about 70 years ago and they captivated people at the time, but it still captivates people today because his crimes are just so shocking. Ed did have some very serious mental illnesses. To me, it's very fascinating to learn about how he grew to become the person that he was and do the things that he did. I want to start by talking about Ed's parents, George and Augusta, because they play a very pivotal role in shaping Ed into becoming the psychopath he was. I mean, it goes without saying, our parents do shape us, and Ed just got some really bad luck when it came to parents. George was a depressed, abusive alcoholic, and Augusta was a religious lunatic. Imagine growing up with parents like that. Let's start with Ed's father, George. He was born in Coon Valley, Wisconsin, and when he was just 3 years old, his parents and older sister were killed when their wagon got caught in a flash flood in the Mississippi River. George was then raised by his grandparents, who were very cold and stern and showed little affection. As George got older, he struggled with depression. Sometimes he felt angry that the world was unfair to him. Other times he blamed himself and felt worthless. This made it hard for him to hold down a job and drove him to become an alcoholic. In his early 20s, he moved to La Crosse, Wisconsin, and when he was 24 years old, he met 19-year-old Augusta. Augusta was a giant nutcase, and that could be putting it mildly. Something common among serial killers is a toxic relationship with their parent, and Ed and Augusta Gein win the prize for the most toxic relationship, in my opinion. Augusta came from a large German family who were very strict, devout Lutherans. They valued hard work and self-discipline. Augusta's father often beat his children if they disobeyed. Augusta and George got married on December 4th, 1899, and who the heck knows why, because these two were complete opposites. George was quiet and withdrawn. Augusta was loud and domineering. It's possible George, being kind of a mild man, is what drew Augusta to him because she could control him. She could boss him around and he would just take it. It's possible George was attracted to Augusta because she came from a large family, and George had grown up with just his grandparents and very little affection, so maybe something in him desired to be part of a large family. Augusta very quickly grew to despise her husband, and she wasn't afraid to let him know it. She was a tyrant and would bark orders at him. She'd call him weak and worthless and berate him for not being able to hold down a job. When she found out he was spending a lot of money on booze, that made her hate him even more. Due to her strict religious beliefs, divorce was not an option. She felt if God had burdened her with a lazy, pathetic husband, that was just her cross to bear. Augusta's views on the world were very irrational. She felt the world was full of immoral people. She thought sex outside of marriage was an abomination, and actually she thought sex in general was a hideous act. She felt it was just something that should be tolerated in order to have a family. She despised having sex, but she wanted to have a family, and there's only one way to do that, so she begrudgingly let her husband into her bed. And 9 months later, she gave birth to her first son in January 1902, a son named Henry. But Augusta didn't feel close to him. When she became pregnant a second time, she prayed that the baby would be a daughter because she thought maybe she would bond better with a girl. When she gave birth on August 27th, 1906, and found out she had another boy, she felt betrayed. But she was resilient. Augusta held her newborn son in her arms and vowed she was going to raise him to be different from all the other foul-mouthed, filthy, vile men in the world who only looked at women to fulfill their disgusting desires. She named the baby Edward Theodore. Ed's first memory of his mother was from when he was around 2 years old. He remembered standing at the top of the stairs and all of a sudden falling, or possibly being pushed. And he was terrified, but all of a sudden he felt his mother grab him and save him. And this was a very significant moment in Ed's life because it taught him that the world was scary, but his mother would protect him. Ed's biggest fear was that he would disappoint his mother. That was like the utmost worst thing in the world he could ever do. One day when Ed was 7, Augusta sent him out with some coins to run an errand, but he accidentally lost the money. When he came home and told his mother, he was sobbing uncontrollably. Augusta sneered at her son and told him he was a pathetic boy and only a mother could love him. George and Augusta ran a grocery store in La Crosse, though Augusta did most of the work. One day when Ed was still quite young, he walked into the shed behind the store and saw his parents butchering a pig. Years later, he could still describe in detail the carcass and seeing his mother covered in blood and slime as she pulled out the intestines. He said this was the first time he became sexually aroused. Augusta grew to feel La Crosse, Wisconsin was a sinful city and she wanted out. In 1913, they used the money they had built up from the grocery store to buy a farm about 40 miles outside of La Crosse. But they only lived there about a year. It's thought that maybe it was still too close to the wicked city of La Crosse for Augusta. The family then found a 195-acre farm 2 hours from La Crosse near Plainfield and bought it. The farm was deeded to Augusta, and I think this says a lot about how controlling Augusta was, because this was a time when pretty much everything was in the husband's name. Plainfield was a very tiny town and only had a population of about 500. It was in an isolated and boring part of Wisconsin. No big cities, no pretty landscape. It was mostly flat land and the soil was sandy, so it made farming difficult. Augusta frickin' loved it though, because they were in the middle of nowhere, far away from the evils of the world. The house was a nice-sized 2-story house, but it was basic. No electricity or indoor plumbing. It had a parlor and living room, several bedrooms, and a summer kitchen on one end that had a door that opened into the regular kitchen. Augusta was a perfectionist, and her house had to be kept in perfect, neat, and tidy order. It didn't take long, and Augusta grew to hate the people of Wisconsin, particularly the women who she viewed as tramps with no morals. Augusta didn't think anybody in Plainfield could be trusted, and she preferred to stay on the farm. She and George's marriage only got worse. George's drinking kept increasing, and when he was drunk, he became abusive and beat his sons. He would beat Ed on his head so bad his ears would ring. George usually didn't stand up to Augusta, but there were times when he would come home from the bars drunk, and Augusta would give him a tongue lashing, and then he would slap her. Augusta would drop to her knees, crying, and pray for her husband's death. George was losing his mind, probably some sort of alcohol-induced delirium, because he sometimes accused Augusta of cheating on him. Which makes no sense because Augusta hated sex. She didn't even want to have sex in her marriage, let alone outside her marriage. There was no Lutheran church in Plainfield, so Augusta took over her son's religious teachings. She read to them every day verses from the Bible about murder, death, and divine retribution. She instilled in them her views that all women were instruments of the devil and sex was vile and immoral. She'd point out women in magazines and say their lipstick and skirts made them tainted. She told her sons they should remain virgins so they would be loyal to her. She made them feel shame if they even just thought of other girls or women. Some psychologists have speculated that it's possible when Ed did masturbate, he pictured his mother, because she made it seem like it was a sin if he pictured any other woman, because all the other women in the world were evil. Augusta highly controlled her son's exposure to outside influences. Ed and Henry were only allowed off the farm to go to school. Anytime they tried to make friends, Augusta told them the friends' parents had a bad reputation and she'd squash any developing relationship. In school, Ed was viewed as shy and a loner. Though he did do well in school and had a huge love of reading that would continue his whole life. But people noted he was a little odd. His eyes would dart around when he talked to people, he had a lopsided smile, and he would laugh at inappropriate times, like when someone talked about someone dying from a heart attack or in an accident. He cried very easily, especially when he was teased in school. And Ed got teased a lot. They made fun of how quiet he was. They also made fun of his left eye because he had a growth in the corner of it, and that eye was droopy. All of this teasing just enforced everything that Augusta was telling Ed about how the world was evil, and the only good person in the world was his mother. In April 1940, George Gein died at the age of 66 from heart failure related to his heavy alcohol use. Augusta, Henry, and Ed were not too sad over his death. They considered him a mean alcoholic who couldn't provide for his family. Plus, in the 3 years prior to George's death, his health had declined significantly and they had to take care of him, so they viewed him as a burden. Henry and Ed were now in their 30s at this point. The farm had never been very fruitful, probably because the soil was so bad. So the brothers did odd jobs around town, mostly handyman type of jobs. But this is kind of surprising and maybe a fact you didn't know about Ed Gein. He babysat, and he was really good at it. Ed didn't relate to kids when he was a kid, but as an adult, he related to kids more than other adults. He'd perform magic tricks for them, do snowball fights in the winter, get them ice cream in the summer, and he'd read to them from his adventure books. People in Plainfield considered Henry and Ed reliable and honest, very helpful. Most people thought Ed was socially awkward and a little odd, but nobody considered him harmful. Henry did not feel the same way about his mother as Ed did. Ed considered Augusta a saint. Henry, however, picked up on her looniness, and he started voicing to his brother his concerns that Ed and Augusta were too close. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were burning marsh vegetation on the farm, and a big gust of wind came up, according to Ed, and the fire got out of control. When the fire department came out in the dark, Ed told them he couldn't find his brother. After the flames were put out, though, he led them directly to where his brother's body laid. Henry was face down and covered in ashes, but didn't have any burns on him. He had some bruises on his head, and the coroner thought Henry had fallen while trying to put out the fire and hit his head. They didn't think foul play was involved. Years later, after Ed's crimes were discovered, people began to wonder if maybe Henry was Ed's first victim. So now it was just Ed and Augusta living on the farm, and Ed was perfectly happy about this. But not long after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a stroke. It was hard for her to get around, so Ed took care of her. He bathed her, dressed her, read the Bible to her, and sometimes he'd even crawl into bed with her to comfort her. This next part does mention animal cruelty, so if that's too much, I'll put a timestamp so you can skip it. In December 1945, Ed and Augusta went to another man's farm to buy straw. When they drove up onto the farm, the man was brutally beating a dog. A woman came running out of the house and yelled at him to stop, but the man beat the dog until the dog died. What an asshole. Most people would be upset over seeing a man beat a dog to death. And Augusta was upset, but not about the dog being beaten to death. She was upset over the sight of this woman because she was not married to the farmer. She told Ed she thought the woman was a harlot. About a week later, Augusta suffered another stroke. Ed rushed her to the hospital, but she passed away on December 29, 1945, when she was 67 years old. As you could guess, Ed was distraught. Harold Schechter wrote a book about Ed Gein, and I just gotta say, he is probably my favorite true crime author. I did get his book. It is right here. But in his book, Harold wrote that when Augusta died, Ed lost his only friend and one true love. Ed was 39 years old at the time of his mother's death, but he responded to it at the funeral like a child. He was sobbing, wailing, tears running down his face, snot, just inconsolable. And now it was just Ed on the farm all by himself. He sold the last of their livestock to pay for his mother's funeral, and he sold a few acres of land too. To make money, he continued to do small jobs around town and started to receive a farm subsidy from the government. Like I said, he had a good reputation around town. People thought he was odd, but he was well-mannered and polite. People felt bad for Ed because they could see how lonely he was after his mother's death. Ed was very small-framed. He was about 5'7" and 140 pounds, but he had the kind of muscle that you get from doing years of farm work, so he was physically strong. He often helped other farmers do their farm work. When he would help farmers at thrashing time, when all the men would rush into the farmer's house to eat lunch, Ed would wait patiently and be the last one to enter. He would also be the only man to bring his dirty dishes to the sink. Ed's descent into depraved madness began after his mother's death. She was the most important person in Ed's life, and now she was gone. Ed stopped taking care of himself, and people noticed how he often had stubble on his face and smelled bad because he didn't bathe regularly. The farm became dilapidated. He stopped mowing, so it got overgrown with grass and weeds. Farm equipment sat out in the open, rusting. Ed boarded up all the rooms in the house except for the kitchen and a bedroom next to the kitchen. The rooms he boarded up remained in almost pristine condition, exactly as his mother had left them. but the kitchen and the bedroom he used became cluttered, dusty, and squalid. Trash, tin cans, and items piled everywhere. Ed got picked on as an adult, just like he had been picked on as a child. Some of the males in town would play tricks on Ed for their own enjoyment. Ed was not a huge drinker. He considered alcohol a sin, but he'd drink beer here and there. One time when they were drinking beer after finishing work in a field, one of the men switched Ed's beer for brandy, and then they laughed when they watched him get drunk. Another time they put a smoke bomb under the hood of his truck and laughed as they watched him react to the smoke. Ed had a love of reading his entire life. Books kept him company when he was alone on the farm. His taste in reading material were unusual. He loved to read about Nazis, cannibals, and human anatomy. He read stories about people who used human skin to create lampshades or exhumed graves to sell bodies to medical science. One particular article fascinated Ed because it was about an American man who had traveled to Denmark to have his male parts turned into female parts. This fascinated Ed because ever since he was a child, he had wondered what it was like to be a girl. It does seem like Ed could have possibly been transgender. During his interrogation, he told police he would take female body parts and put them over his male body parts. In 1954, Ed started spending a lot of time at a tavern about 7 miles from his house. He was infatuated with the woman who ran the tavern, 53-year-old Mary Hogan. Mary was a hefty woman and spoke with a thick German accent. She probably did remind Ed of his mother physically, but their personalities were completely different. His mother was a saint in his eyes. Mary, on the other hand, was twice divorced and foul-mouthed. She had moved to Wisconsin from Chicago, and there were rumors she had once worked for the mob or had been a madam. On December 8, 1954, Ed went into Mary's tavern. It was just him and Mary. He pulled out a rifle and shot and killed Mary. He drug her body out the back door and brought her back to the farm. When people came across the empty tavern with blood on the floor and a spent shell, they knew foul play had occurred. But they had no clue who had done it. Nothing linked Mary to Ed. When people would talk around town and wonder where Mary was, Ed would sometimes joke, "Oh, she's at the farm." And people would laugh and think it was just a joke and just part of Ed being socially awkward. Meanwhile, rumors started going around Plainfield that Ed kept shrunken heads in his house. They had apparently been seen by some neighbor kids who had come onto the farm. People didn't think too much of it, though. Ed had a reputation for being an odd man. It wasn't surprising if he liked to collect shrunken heads from the South Pacific or whatnot. But after this started spreading around town, Ed stopped letting anyone go into his house. In the fall of 1957, when Ed was 51, he started hanging around the Warden hardware store in Plainfield. This was owned by 58-year-old Bernice Warden. She had taken over the store after her husband passed away, and she was a very smart businesswoman. She was able to make the store flourish, and for a while she was the only female dealer of International Harvest products in the area. She was a hard worker, but also a doting grandmother who loved to go fishing. Ed kept asking Bernice to go to dinner or go roller skating, but she always turned him down. Saturday, November 16, 1957, was opening weekend for deer hunting. The majority of the men in Plainfield left that morning to go hunting, except for Ed. Around 8 a.m., Ed headed into town to Warden's Hardware. The night before, he had been in the store and told Bernice he would come back in the morning to buy antifreeze. That morning, he brought his container into the store with him. Bernice filled it with antifreeze and wrote him a receipt. Ed asked her to show him a rifle that was in the front window. Bernice walked over to the display and reached for the gun. As her back was turned to Ed, he pulled out his own rifle and shot her in the back of the head. He drug her body out the back door and into the store's truck and drove away. He parked that truck among some trees outside of town, walked back into town where he had parked his 1949 Ford sedan, drove back to where he had left the hardware truck, moved Bernice's body into his truck, and headed home with her body. Since most of the town was out hunting, it wasn't noticed that Bernice was missing until several hours later. Her son Frank, who happened to be the deputy sheriff, returned from hunting and stopped at the filling station near the hardware store. Someone told him they saw the hardware store truck drive away that morning, and the store had been locked ever since. Frank walked over and found the hardware store locked, so he went home, got his keys, and then let himself into the store. He knew immediately that something was wrong. The cash register was missing, and there was a trail of blood on the floor that led out the back door. Frank called the sheriff, Arthur Schley, and when he arrived, Frank said, "He's done something to her." Sheriff Schley asked who, and Frank said, "Ed Gein." He told him how Ed had been hanging around the store a lot lately and how he had been in the store the night before and overheard Ed tell Bernice he'd be back in the morning for antifreeze. Frank had also noticed that the last sales receipt for the day was for antifreeze. Police found Ed at a neighbor's house where he had went for supper and coffee. They asked to speak to him and set him in the back seat of a squad car. A police officer asked Ed what he had done that day, and Ed told him. The officer asked Ed to tell him what he did again. This time Ed changed his story, and the police officer pointed that out. Ed looked at him, blinked, and said, "Somebody framed me." The officer said, "Framed you for what?" And Ed said, "For Miss Warden." "She's dead, ain't she?" Police put Ed in a jail cell and then went out to the farm. By this time it was dark when Sheriff Schley and other officers drove onto Ed Gein's farm. They entered the house through the summer kitchen. It was dark and they were fumbling around with flashlights when one of them bumped into something hanging from a rafter. When he looked at it, he thought it was a skinned deer. To his horror, he realized it was the body of Bernice Warden. She was hanging upside down by her feet, nude, and was missing her head. She had been sliced open from her pelvis to her sternum, gutted like a deer. Sheriff Schley ran outside and threw up. He called for more officers to come to the house, and they started a deep search. Bernice's body would not be the worst thing they would discover that night. As they made their way through the trash in Ed's home, they made gruesome discovery after gruesome discovery. They found Bernice's head in the summer kitchen in a corner. She had hooked nails in her ears with rope attached to it, so it looked like her head could be hung up. Her heart was in a bag near the stove. They found body parts that did not belong to Bernice. There were face masks hanging on one wall. These were probably the shrunken heads that the kids had seen. Some of those face masks had lipstick on. They found a box full of noses and another box full of female vulva. One of the vulva was painted silver and trimmed with a red bow. Ed wasn't just collecting human body parts. He was making things out of them. He made bowls out of skulls, a belt from nipples, a drawstring pull from lips, lampshades from human skin. He made aprons and leggings out of skin from legs. And there were 4 chairs he had upholstered with human skin. He had made a woman's suit that he later told police that he would wear and walk around the farm pretending to be his mother because he had wanted to crawl into her skin. One officer saw some hair in a bag, so he grabbed it and pulled it out. He then stared in horror at it. An officer behind him said, "My God, it's Mary Hogan." She had been missing for 3 years at this point. The search at Ed's house went into the early morning hours. At one point, Sheriff Schley was so disgusted with everything they were finding that he drove to the jail cell and beat Ed's head against the wall, demanding that he confess. News started to spread that Bernice had been found in Ed's home. People were like, "Ed Gein? No way. He was weird, but he was meek and harmless."
He's a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in the man, he seems to be a little hot.
Townspeople knew this was more than just a murder case when news outlets from Chicago started to show up in Plainfield. People then heard about all the body parts found in Ed's home. During Ed's interrogation, he cooperated and he was very obedient. Police couldn't believe that they were questioning a cold-blooded killer because across the table from them, Ed was calm and nonchalant. He was being honest about all of his crimes, but it was like he was telling them about what he ate for dinner the night before instead of very gruesome things. He was a monster, but he was childlike. After 30 hours of interrogation, which Ed did not have a lawyer present for, Ed did confess to the murder of Bernice Warden. But he claimed the gun accidentally went off and he went into a daze and didn't remember anything after that. He denied killing Mary Hogan, but he didn't know police had found her head in his house. Due to the number of body parts in Ed's house, the police were thinking Ed was this massive serial killer, but Ed shocked them when he told them that wasn't the case. He had killed 2 people, but he had gotten most of the body parts from robbing graves. He said starting in 1947, he made trips at night to local cemeteries to dig up graves of middle-aged women who had recently been buried. Ed would read obituaries and seemed to be looking for women similar to his mother. Ed said sometimes he would dig up the graves, take what he wanted, and then bury the coffin again. Sometimes he would take the entire body back to his house. He again claimed to have been in a daze while he would do this. Ed was insistent with police that he never had sex with any of the bodies because they smelled too bad. People did wonder if Ed had tried to dig up the grave of his mother, but she had been buried in a more sandier part of the cemetery, so her grave had been covered in cement, and he couldn't dig her up. Ed admitted that he sometimes wore those face masks over his own face. When police asked him how long he would wear them, he said, "Oh, not too long. I had things to do." He used salt and oil to try to keep the skin fresh. He said he painted the one vulva silver because it had started to turn green. Police took Ed to the farm and had him show them around. He took them to an ash heap where he said he burned the rest of Mary Hogan's body. They found some bone fragments in the ash, and testing confirmed it did belong to Mary. But they also found teeth, and that couldn't have been Mary's because her teeth were still in her head. No one wanted to believe that Ed had robbed graves. It was just too much. Plus, it was hard to believe. Ed claimed to have made about 40 trips to 3 local cemeteries, Plainfield, Hancock, and Spiritland. They really didn't want to do this, but the only way to confirm if Ed was telling the truth was to exhume some of the graves that he said he had dug up. They decided to exhume 2 of the 9 that Ed had said he robbed from. The first was Eleanor Adams. She died in August 1951, and Ed dug her grave up the night she was buried. 2 gravediggers started digging her grave with shovels. Standing around the grave were police, investigators, and Eleanor's widow, Floyd. It only took about an hour to get to the top of her casket. Right away, they could see it had been tampered with because the wooden cover was split in 2. When they opened the casket, they braced themselves for the sight of a decomposed body, but the only thing in the coffin was a crowbar. Floyd later told reporters that everything was in there except the body. The second grave they exhumed was Mabel Everson, who died in April 1951. They found some of her bones sitting on top of her coffin. This was due to Ed sometimes feeling remorse after he had taken bodies, and he then returned parts he didn't want. The findings in these 2 graves confirmed that Ed had told the truth about robbing graves. Ed was charged with the first-degree murder of Bernice Warden. He wasn't charged for the murder of Mary Hogan due to prohibitive cost, which I'm not really sure what that means. Ed's confession was ruled inadmissible since Sheriff Slay had lost his cool and beat Ed against the wall of the jail cell. Arthur Schley was very traumatized by this case and died in 1968 from a heart attack when he was only 43. Most people feel it was due to the stress of Ed Gein's case. Ed was admitted to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin for a 30-day psychiatric evaluation. Pretty much every reputable psychological test available was given to Ed. He was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. Psychiatrists said Ed had the most unique case of psychosis in modern psychiatric history. They said he was, quote, inordinately emotionally attached to his mother, unquote. You think? They noted it was a little difficult to question Ed because he was very suggestible, and if you asked leading questions, he would just agree with you and say things like, yeah, I suppose, or yeah, you're probably right, I did do that. They described him as, quote, an introverted, odd, withdrawn personality that has difficulty relating closely to other people, unquote. Ed answered questions willingly, but when pressed for details about his crimes, he was more evasive. For the most part, he was coherent, but he sometimes would ramble when he spoke. He would cry easily, and psychiatrists noticed he had feminine characteristics. Ed had an average IQ. They gave him an extensive physical, and nothing too abnormal was found. Ed often complained of physical ailments like headaches and stomach aches, double vision, whatnot, and psychiatrists wondered if that was related to his schizophrenia. Ed was cooperative and followed all the rules in the hospital. He had very strict morality standards, thanks to his mother. Ed talked about being lonely and how he felt his neighbors didn't want anything to do with him unless they could get something out of it that benefited them. He said he had never had any kind of sexual experience in his life and again denied doing anything sexual to the bodies. Some psychologists think Ed probably did commit necrophilia, though. Ed seemed to have hostility towards women and voiced his mother's sentiments that all women were evil. But he also alluded to being comforted when he would have a dead body in his house and that he treated them like dolls. Psychiatrists think Ed dug up middle-aged women's bodies to try to find a replacement for his beloved mother. He was lonely, and the dead bodies gave him companionship. Ed claimed to sometimes see faces in leaves and hear his dead mother talking to him. He'd hear her telling him to be good. He also claimed to feel like he could raise the dead, and that was one of the reasons he robbed graves. He admitted he tried to raise his mother from the dead, but obviously couldn't, and had felt very disappointed. Psychiatrists do think the death of his mother and the loneliness that followed pushed Ed over the edge into madness. He told psychiatrists his mother was, quote, good in every way, unquote. When he talked about her strokes and how they affected her, he began to cry and said she didn't deserve to suffer. He only had negative feelings towards his father and said he was an alcoholic who abused him. He still insisted to psychiatrists that he had no memory of killing Mary Hogan and that murdering Bernice Warden had been an accident. But in his mind, both women had been evil. Mary was foul-mouthed and had a shady past. Bernice had stolen her husband from another woman, in Ed's eyes. It's thought Ed targeted Mary and Bernice because he couldn't understand why evil women like them were alive when his mother, who was a saint, was dead. As much as Ed worshipped his mother, some psychiatrists think he hated her for the lifetime of torture she inflicted on him. She was stern, controlling, showed very little affection. She'd scold him over little things. Because they kind of resembled his mother, some wonder if maybe Ed took out his negative feelings towards his mother on them. On January 6, 1958, Ed had a sanity hearing. When he showed up, his appearance shocked people. He had been hollow-faced the last time he was seen in public. After spending the past few months in the hospital getting 3 square meals a day instead of eating beans out of a can, which had been his usual meal, Ed had filled out. Ed was declared to be legally insane, so he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The psychiatric report said Ed had been, quote, suffering from a schizophrenic process for an undetermined number of years. As a result, although Mr. Gein might voice knowledge of the difference between right and wrong, his ability to make judgment would always be influenced by the existent mental illness, unquote. Ed was sent back to the Central State Hospital. Ed's crimes captivated the media. In December 1957, Time and Life magazines ran stories about Ed. Time described Ed as a middle-aged mama's boy. Everyone was fascinated by this case because it was just so sensational. Plainfield was just this tiny town in Wisconsin in the Midwest, and this put it on the map. Plainfield became known as the home of America's most notorious psychopath. People flocked to Plainfield to drive by the farm out of curiosity. I did the same this fall because I was still curious to see the sights, even though not a lot of buildings are left anymore. Ed became known as the Butcher of Plainfield and the Plainfield Ghoul. People came up with one-line jokes that were referred to as Geiners. What does Ed Gein keep in his cookie jar? Ladyfingers. Why won't anyone play cards with Ed Gein? He might come up with a good hand. Life in the Central State Hospital was very good for Ed. It was a considerable improvement over his living conditions on the farm. He often sat in a chair in the lounge room by himself. Never got in any trouble. He didn't need tranquilizing meds to calm him like some patients did. Ed's confinement to the Central State Hospital was just until he was deemed sane enough to stand trial. So every 6 months, Ed's sanity was evaluated. For 10 years, he was still deemed insane until 1968. He was determined sane enough to stand trial. November 7th, 1968, Ed's trial for the murder of Bernice Warden started. It had no jury and it was split into 2 parts. He was first tried for the murder and then he was tried to see if he was insane. Ed still insisted the gun accidentally went off when he was inspecting it, and he went into a daze and didn't remember taking Bernice Warden's body back to his house. The judge didn't buy it and found Ed guilty of the first-degree murder of Bernice Warden. His sanity trial determined Ed was still insane and ruled he was not guilty of the murder due to insanity. The judge sent Ed back to the Central State Hospital for the rest of his life or until he recovered from his mental illness. In February 1974, Ed filed a petition claiming he was now fully competent and should be let out of the hospital. Basically, he was saying he was no longer crazy. Psychiatrists examined him and gave their findings to the judge. Ed's petition was denied because he was determined to still be a schizophrenic who had delusions that led him to be dangerous. In 1978, Central State Hospital was converted to a correctional facility, and Ed and other patients were transferred to the Mendota Mental Health Institute. Just a fun fact, Central State Hospital was renamed the Dodge Correctional Institution and is now home to Chris Watts. It was also once home to Stephen Avery. Back in 1958, the Gein farm was scheduled to be auctioned off. This worried the people of Plainfield because they didn't want someone to buy it and turn it into a museum or House of Horrors tourist attraction. The auction was scheduled to be on March 30th, 1958, but around 2 a.m. on March 20th, a neighbor woke up and discovered Ed's house was engulfed in flames. Firemen rushed out, but it was too late. Ed Gein's house was a pile of burning ash and rubble. The cause of the fire was never determined, but most people think it was arson and set by someone who didn't want to see it turn into a tourist attraction. The fire marshal apparently didn't put too much effort into investigating the cause of the fire. But that was probably because the fire marshal was Frank Warden, Bernice Warden's son. When Ed was told the house had burned down, he paused and said, "Just as well." On March 23rd, people were allowed to come onto the farm to look at everything that was going to be auctioned off. Car after car showed up. There were so many people coming onto the farm, police had to direct traffic. It was estimated around 20,000 people showed up that day. A lot of them were there to look at the pile of ash that was once home to the monster Ed Gein.
There will be an auction here Palm Sunday, but this house and the personal belongings of Ed Gein will be conspicuously absent. Call it an act of God or whatever you will. The main attraction will be missing, reduced to a mass of rubble by a mysterious fire.
The entire farm itself, the land and remaining buildings, sold for $3,883, which is about $40,000 today. So pretty cheap for a farm. It was bought by a real estate developer, and he tore down all the buildings and planted several trees on the property. And that's all you see today. And you can see where the driveway was. Otherwise, it is just a bunch of trees. There's really no sign of the horror that went down on that property. One of the most sought-after items at the auction was Ed's 1949 Ford sedan, which he used to transport Bernice Warden's body to his house. There was a bidding war, and it sold for $760, which is about $7,500 today. It was bought by a carnival sideshow operator named Bunny Gibbons. He put 2 wax figures in it, a man in the driver's seat and a woman covered in fake blood in the back. How tasteless can you get? And he'd bring that to carnivals and fairs around Wisconsin and charge people 25 cents to see the Ed Gein ghoul car. People protested, and sometimes police would come and kick Bunny and his car out. He eventually tried touring with it in Illinois, but didn't get much more interest, so he eventually gave up. The media was fascinated by Ed Gein, and he ended up inspiring several movie killers. The first, and the one that most resembles Ed Gein's actual life, was Psycho. It was first a book written by Robert Bloch in 1959. Norman Bates was based heavily on Ed Gein. The fictional character Norman Bates had a hobby of taxidermy. The author gave him that hobby because there were rumors that Ed Gein liked to do taxidermy, but he actually didn't. As most of us know, Alfred Hitchcock got the rights to the movie, and it was groundbreaking. This was one of the first times in a movie that the villain was a human, and not a vampire or mummy or creature from the Black Lagoon. Ed Gein also inspired Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died in the Mendota Mental Health Institute. He had lung cancer and was suffering from respiratory failure. Newspapers all over the country printed his obituary. Ed was buried in between his brother and his mother in the Plainfield Cemetery. Ironically, one of the cemeteries he robbed graves from, and also where Bernice Warden's grave is. His gravestone kept getting vandalized. Someone stole his gravestone in 2000, but it was recovered in 2001. It's now in storage in the Washoe County Sheriff's Department. I went to the cemetery when I was there this fall, and I saw Ed Gein's grave. And there is no headstone, but it's very blatantly obvious where he is because there's the headstone of his father, his mother, there's an empty space, and then there's the headstone of his brother. People are still vandalizing his grave to this day, even without a headstone, because when I arrived there, somebody had stuck a little plastic skeleton hand right where the headstone would be. There's often a lot of discussion about nurture versus nature when it comes to people who do bad things. Like, what causes them to be bad? Are people born evil, or does their environment cause them to be evil? In Ed's case, you really do have to wonder if he had not been born to an abusive alcoholic and a religious lunatic, would he still have done what he did? That's all I have for this case. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.